Nestled in the heart of a quiet countryside town, the small community of Ravenwood lived in harmony with nature. The town was surrounded by the dense and mysterious Ravenwood Forest, a place where the trees whispered ancient secrets, and the underbrush teemed with life. For the townsfolk, the forest was both a source of beauty and a place of caution. Tales of hidden predators and strange happenings often kept people at bay. But not Emily Parker. Emily, a curious 12-year-old girl with wild auburn hair and a streak of independence, found solace in the woods. To her, the forest was a sanctuary, a place where she could escape the dullness of everyday life and the weight of loneliness. With her father gone and her mother, Sarah, working long hours at the town's diner, Emily often wandered alone, collecting leaves, sketching animals, and dreaming of adventures. One late afternoon, as the golden light of the setting sun streamed through the tall pines, Emily ventured deeper into the woods than usual. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of pine and earth. She hummed softly to herself, her boots crunching against the fallen leaves, when a faint sound broke the stillness, a whimper, barely audible above the rustling of the trees. Curious, Emily paused, tilting her head to listen. The sound came again, a soft, pitiful cry that tugged at her heart. Following the noise, she pushed through the thick undergrowth until she stumbled upon a clearing. There, lying among the ferns, was a small dog. The animal was covered in dirt, its golden fur matted and streaked with dried blood. Its ribs jutted out painfully, and one of its paws was caught in a rusty trap, the metal biting cruelly into its flesh. Emily's heart clenched at the sight. The dog's wide, frightened eyes met hers, and in that moment, something unspoken passed between them, a plea for help, a flicker of trust. "Oh, you poor thing," Emily whispered, crouching down slowly to avoid scaring the dog. "It's okay. I'm here to help." The dog whimpered again but didn't move, as though it had no strength left to resist. Emily pulled off her scarf and carefully approached, speaking in a soft, soothing tone. "I'm not going to hurt you," she said, inching closer. She reached for the trap, her hands trembling as she struggled to pry it open. The dog let out a sharp yelp, his body tensing in pain, but it didn't bite or lash out. It seemed to understand that Emily was trying to help. After what felt like an eternity, the trap finally gave way. Emily freed the dog's injured paw and wrapped it gently in her scarf to stop the bleeding. "There we go," she murmured, stroking its head. "You're safe now." The dog's eyes softened, its body relaxing slightly as it leaned into her touch. Emily smiled, a warm glow spreading through her chest. She had always wanted a dog, but her mother had never allowed it, citing the responsibilities and costs. Yet here was this creature, so helpless and in need, and Emily knew she couldn't leave it behind. "I'm taking you home," she said firmly. "Your name will be Max." Lifting the dog carefully, Emily cradled it against her chest and began the long trek back to town. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the forest floor. But Emily didn't feel afraid. Max's quiet breathing and the steady beat of her own heart filled the silence, creating a bond that felt as natural as the forest itself. By the time she reached the edge of the woods, the sky had turned a dusky pink, and the first stars were beginning to twinkle. As Emily carried Max into her small house, her mother's voice rang out from the kitchen. "Emily, where have you been?" "Dinners." Sarah's voice trailed off as she stepped into the hallway and saw the bundle in her daughter's arms. Her eyes widened in alarm. "What is that?" "It's a dog, Mom," Emily said, her voice pleading. "He's hurt, and I couldn't just leave him there." Sarah frowned, crossing her arms. "Emily, we've talked about this. We can't take care of a dog. We don't have the time or the money. He needs me." "Mom," Emily interrupted, her voice trembling. "I'll take care of him. I'll feed him, clean him, everything. Please." Sarah hesitated, her gaze shifting between her daughter's determined face and the injured dog. Finally, she sighed. "We'll talk about it tomorrow. For now, Clean him up and keep him in the garage. But this isn't permanent. Emily. Emily nodded, her heart soaring despite her mother's reluctance. She carried Max to the garage, where she made a bed for him out of old blankets and began cleaning his wounds with warm water. Max watched her with tired but trusting eyes, his tail thumping faintly against the ground. As Emily sat beside him that night, stroking his fur and whispering promises of safety, she felt a sense of purpose she had never known before. Max wasn't just a dog. He was her friend, her protector, and, in some inexplicable way, her partner in a bond that had only just begun. The first few days with Max were a whirlwind of adjustment. Emily woke early every morning to tend to him, sneaking scraps of food from the kitchen and spending hours cleaning and dressing his injured paw. Though he was weak, Max's spirit was undeniable. His tail wagged faintly whenever Emily entered the garage, and his dark brown eyes followed her every move, filled with a quiet gratitude that melted her heart. Emily's mother, Sarah, remained skeptical. Every evening, she would glance into the garage, her lips pressed into a thin line. "You know this is temporary, Emily," she reminded her daughter one night as they sat at the dinner table. "We can't keep him. It's not practical." Emily stared down at her plate, her appetite gone. "He has nowhere else to go. Mom, I can take care of him. I promise." Sarah sighed, rubbing her temples. "We'll see, but don't get too attached." Despite her mother's warnings, Emily couldn't help but grow attached. Max was more than just a dog to her. He was a companion in a world that often felt lonely and unkind. At school, Emily was quiet and reserved, often overshadowed by the louder, more confident kids. She spent most of her time alone, sketching in her notebook or daydreaming about the adventures she and Max could have. One crisp Saturday morning, Emily decided Max was ready to venture outside. His paw had healed enough for him to limp around, and he seemed restless, his energy building with each passing day. She tied an old shoelace around his neck as a makeshift leash and led him into the backyard. The moment they stepped outside, Max's ears perked up, his nose twitching as he sniffed the air. His tail wagged furiously, and for the first time, Emily saw a spark of the playful pup he must have been before his ordeal. "Come on, boy," she said, leading him toward the woods. "Let's explore." They wandered along the familiar trails, Emily chatting to Max as though he could understand every word. "This is my favorite spot," she said, pointing to a clearing where sunlight streamed through the trees, creating a golden glow. "I come here to think. Feels like magic, doesn't it?" Max barked softly, his tail wagging, and Emily laughed. "I'll take that as a yes." As they ventured deeper into the forest, Emily noticed how attuned Max was to their surroundings. His ears swiveled at every sound, and his nose was constantly in motion, picking up scents that were imperceptible to her. At one point, he froze, his body tense, and let out a low growl. Emily followed his gaze and spotted a snake slithering across the path ahead. Her heart raced, but Max stood his ground, his protective instincts on full display. Only when the snake disappeared into the underbrush did he relax, his tail wagging as if to reassure her that everything was fine. "You're amazing, Max," Emily whispered, kneeling to ruffle his fur. "I don't know what I'd do without you." Their bond grew stronger with each passing day. Max seemed to understand Emily in a way no one else did. He was there to comfort her when she was upset, resting his head on her lap as she vented about school or the kids who teased her for being weird. He followed her everywhere, his loyalty unwavering, and Emily felt a sense of security she hadn't known before. One evening, as Emily sat in the garage sketching by the dim light of a lantern, Sarah appeared in the doorway. She watched quietly for a moment, her arms crossed, before stepping inside. "He's looking better," she said, nodding toward Max, who was curled up at Emily's feet. Emily looked up, surprised. "He is. I've been giving him the scraps you said we couldn't waste." Sarah sighed, sitting down on an overturned crate. "You're really serious about this, aren't you?" Emily nodded, her voice firm. "He needs me, Mom. And I think I need him too." For a long moment, Sarah said nothing, her expression unreadable. Then, to Emily's astonishment, she reached out and scratched Max behind the ears. The dog's tail thumped against the floor, and a small smile tugged at Sarah's lips. "He's a good dog," she admitted. "But if we're keeping him, he's your responsibility. All of it. Understand?" Emily's eyes lit up. "Really? You mean it?" Sarah nodded. "Yes, but I'm holding you to that promise." Emily threw her arms around her mother, grinning from ear to ear. "Thank you, Mom. I promise I won't let you down." From that day forward, Max became a permanent part of their family. He slept at the foot of Emily's bed, his presence a comforting weight in the darkness. Together, they explored the forest, discovering hidden nooks and secret trails that seemed like they were made just for them. Max even began to accompany Emily to the edge of town, waiting patiently outside the diner while she ran errands for her mother. But life in Ravenwood was not as peaceful as it seemed. Rumors began to spread of hunters and outsiders venturing into the forest, setting traps and claiming that the woods were overrun with wildlife. Emily dismissed the stories at first, too wrapped up in her newfound happiness to pay them much mind. It wasn't until one fateful afternoon, when Max led her to a rusted trap hidden beneath a pile of leaves, that Emily realized the danger lurking in their beloved forest was all too real. The trap was old and rusted, its jagged edges coated in dried blood. Emily's heart sank as she crouched to examine it, the cold metal glinting in the dappled sunlight. Max stood beside her, his nose close to the ground, sniffing furiously. His hackles were raised, and he let out a low growl, his instincts warning of danger. "Who would do something like this?" Emily muttered, her stomach churning at the thought of an animal caught in such a cruel device. She reached out to spring the trap, wincing at the sharp snap of the metal teeth closing together. "This is horrible," Max barked softly, as if in agreement. Emily straightened up, her gaze sweeping the forest around them. The woods, which had always felt like a sanctuary, suddenly seemed darker, more menacing. She felt a creeping unease, as though unseen eyes were watching from the shadows. That evening, Emily couldn't shake the image of the trap from her mind. She sat at the kitchen table, absently pushing her food around her plate, while her mother folded laundry nearby. "Mom," Emily began hesitantly, "have you heard about traps being set in the forest?" Sarah glanced at her, frowning. "I've heard rumors. Some people think the wildlife is getting out of control, scaring off hikers and damaging crops. There's talk about hunters coming in to manage it." Emily's grip on her fork tightened. "Manage it? That's ridiculous. The forest is fine the way it is." Sarah sighed, setting down a folded shirt. "Not everyone feels that way, Emily. People worry about their safety and their livelihoods. If hunters can help, hunters don't help." Emily interrupted, her voice rising. "They're just killing for sport." "Emily," Sarah's tone was firm, her eyes narrowing. "I know you love the forest, but you can't control what other people do. Stay out of it, okay? It's not your fight." Emily clenched her jaw, frustration bubbling inside her. She wanted to argue, to make her mother understand, but she knew it was pointless. Instead, she excused herself and went to her room, Max trotting after her with a concerned whine. As she sat on her bed, stroking Max's soft fur, Emily made a silent promise. She couldn't sit by and let the forest be destroyed. She would protect it no matter what. The next day, Emily decided to investigate. She packed a small bag with water and snacks, then headed into the forest with Max at her side. Together, they followed the trails deeper than they had ever gone before, searching for signs of traps or other disturbances. It wasn't long before they found another one, a newer, shinier trap hidden beneath a patch of moss. This time, Emily noticed something else. A set of boot prints leading away from the trap. The prints were large and deep, suggesting someone heavy and deliberate had placed it there. Max sniffed the tracks, his ears twitching, and let out a sharp bark, tugging at his makeshift leash. "You smell something, boy?" Emily asked, her heart pounding. She hesitated for a moment, then decided to follow the trail. The footprints led them to a small clearing, where Emily froze at the sight before her. A man was crouched near a pile of traps, sorting through them with practiced ease. He was tall and broad-shouldered, wearing a camouflage jacket and a hunting knife strapped to his belt. His face was weathered, his eyes cold and calculating. Max growled low in his throat, his body tense. Emily grabbed his leash, pulling him close as she backed away, her heart racing. But it was too late. The man had heard them. He stood up slowly, turning to face them, a smirk curling his lips. "Well, what do we have here?" he drawled, his voice dripping with disdain. "A little girl and her mutt, poking around where they don't belong." Emily swallowed hard, trying to keep her voice steady. "You're not supposed to set traps here. This is public land." The man chuckled, the sound sending a shiver down her spine. "Public land? Huh? That's cute. You think you own this forest? It's not yours either." Emily shot back, her fear giving way to anger. "You're hurting animals for no reason." His smirk faded, replaced by a steely glare. "Listen, kid, you don't know what you're talking about. I'm just doing my job, keeping the wildlife in check. Maybe you should run along before you get hurt." Max barked sharply, stepping in front of Emily as if to shield her. The man's eyes flicked to the dog, narrowing. "That mutt of yours better watch itself," he said coldly. "Dogs like that don't last long out here." Emily's fists clenched, but she knew better than to argue further. Without another word, she turned and hurried back down the trail, Max at her side. Her heart pounded as she replayed the encounter in her mind, the man's threat echoing in her ears. When she returned home, Emily told her mother everything. Sarah's face paled as she listened, and she immediately forbade Emily from going back into the forest. "This is exactly what I was afraid of," she said. "You could have been hurt or worse. Promise me you'll stay away." "I can't just do nothing," Emily protested. "The forest needs someone to protect it, and it's not going to be you," Sarah snapped. "You're just a child. Emily, let the adults handle this." But Emily knew the adults wouldn't do anything. They were too caught up in their own fears and self-interest to stand up to someone like the man in the clearing. If no one else was going to fight for the forest, she would have to do it herself. As she lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, Emily felt a surge of determination. Max lay curled up at her feet, his steady breathing a reminder that she wasn't alone. Together, they would find a way to stop the hunters and protect the forest they loved. The morning after her encounter in the woods, Emily found herself restless. She couldn't shake the memory of the hunter's cold glare or the casual cruelty in his voice. Even Max seemed on edge, his ears perking up at every noise outside as though he expected danger to appear at any moment. Emily decided she couldn't keep quiet about what she'd seen. The school. During lunch, she gathered the courage to tell her classmates about the traps and the man in the forest. "He's setting traps everywhere," she said, her voice firm. "It's dangerous for animals, and for people too." But instead of concern, her classmates responded with laughter. "Are you sure you didn't imagine it, Emily?" sneered Josh, one of the older boys. "Maybe you've been hanging out with that dog of yours too much." Another girl chimed in. "Yeah, everyone knows the forest isn't safe. If hunters are out there, they're probably just doing us a favor." Emily's cheeks flushed with anger. "They're not helping. They're killing animals for no reason." But her words fell on deaf ears. The other kids dismissed her, returning to their conversations as if she hadn't spoken at all. Emily clenched her fists, biting back tears. Why didn't anyone care? That evening, Emily overheard a conversation between her mother and one of the neighbors, Mr. Thompson, They were standing by the fence, their voices carrying through the cool evening air. "I heard Victor Kane's been hired by someone big," Mr. Thompson said, his tone low. "They're planning to cut down part of the forest. They're saying it's for safety. Something about overpopulation of wildlife." "Safety," Sarah replied, her disbelief evident. "More like greed. That forest's been fine for years without anyone interfering." "Well, it's not my place to argue," Mr. Thompson muttered. "But you know how people get when money's involved." Emily's heart sank as she listened. It wasn't just about the traps. There was a larger plan to destroy the forest. And it seemed like most of the town was willing to look the other way. The next day, Emily decided to take matters into her own hands. She printed out flyers warning people about the traps and the dangers posed by Victor Kane. With Max trotting beside her, she went door to door, handing them out to anyone who would take one. Some people thanked her politely, but most simply shrugged or shook their heads. "It's just a few trees," one man said dismissively. "They'll grow back." At the diner, Emily tried to convince her mother to put up one of the flyers. "Mom, people need to know what's happening," she pleaded, but Sarah shook her head. "I understand you're upset, Emily, but this isn't going to change anything. People have already made up their minds." Frustrated, Emily stormed out of the diner. Max followed her, his tail drooping as if he could sense her disappointment. Later that afternoon, as Emily and Max wandered through the forest, they stumbled upon a new clearing. The ground was littered with broken branches and fresh tire tracks, evidence of heavy machinery. Emily's chest tightened as she realized what it meant. They had already started clearing the land. Max growled softly, his nose pointing toward a group of men in the distance. Emily ducked behind a tree, pulling Max close. She watched as Victor Kane barked orders at his crew, his voice carrying over the roar of a chainsaw. "This is just the beginning," he said, smirking. "Once we get this section cleared, the rest will follow." Emily's stomach churned with anger and helplessness. She wanted to run out and confront him, to shout at him to stop, but she knew it would be useless and dangerous. Instead, she pulled out her phone and took photos of the scene, documenting everything she could. That evening, Emily called a meeting with a few people she thought might listen. Her science teacher, Ms. Carter, who was known for her environmental activism, Mr. Eldridge, an elderly man who often told stories about the forest from his childhood, and a couple of classmates who had shown interest in her flyers. They gathered in the park, sitting on picnic tables under the glow of the streetlights. Emily shared what she had seen and showed them the photos on her phone. "We have to do something," she said, her voice shaking with urgency. "If we don't stop them now, the whole forest will be gone." Ms. Carter nodded thoughtfully. "You're right, Emily, but this isn't going to be easy. Victor Kane has connections, and people in this town are afraid to stand up to him. We have to try," Emily insisted. "If we don't, who will?" The small group spent the rest of the evening brainstorming ideas. They discussed everything from starting a petition to organizing a protest at the town hall. Emily felt a flicker of hope for the first time in days. Maybe, just maybe, they could make a difference. But not everyone in town was supportive. Rumors began to spread about Emily and her efforts. Some people accused her of causing trouble, while others dismissed her as a naive child. Even her mother warned her to be careful. "You're making enemies, Emily," Sarah said one night as they washed dishes. "Victor Kane isn't someone you want to mess with." "I'm not afraid of him," Emily replied, though the truth was she was terrified. But the thought of losing the forest and Max gave her the courage to keep going. As the days passed, tensions in the town grew. Victor Kane caught wind of Emily's actions and began targeting her directly. One evening, as she walked home from the park, she found a trap set near her front yard, a cruel reminder that Victor was watching. Emily stared at the trap, her hands trembling with a mixture of fear and rage. Max growled beside her, his eyes locked on the shadowy figure disappearing into the distance. "This isn't over," Emily whispered, her resolve hardening. Not by a long shot. The trap near Emily's yard was a clear message. Victor Kane wasn't just watching. He was warning her to back off. But instead of scaring her into submission, it only fueled Emily's determination. That night, Emily sat on the floor of her room with Max curled up beside her. She traced her fingers through his fur, finding comfort in his steady presence. "We're going to stop him, Max," she whispered. "No matter what it takes." Max's ears twitched, and he let out a soft bark as if to say he understood. The following morning, Emily took her concerns to Ms. Carter, her science teacher. Together, they drafted a formal complaint to the local authorities, including the photos Emily had taken of the traps and the clearing. They sent the evidence off with hope but little expectation. The town's leaders had shown time and again that they cared more about money than the environment. As Emily waited for a response, she continued her patrols of the forest with Max. Each day, they found new signs of destruction, trees marked for cutting, fresh traps set along well-worn trails, and the occasional carcass of an animal that hadn't been lucky enough to escape. The sight of it all made Emily's blood boil. One afternoon, while exploring a deeper part of the woods, Max suddenly froze. His body tensed, his ears pointed forward, and he let out a low growl. Emily followed his gaze and spotted movement in the distance. Victor and two of his men were unloading crates from a truck. She crouched behind a tree, her heart racing as she watched them set up a larger operation. "Keep an eye out," Victor barked at one of his men. "That girl and her dog have been snooping around. If they show up, I want to know immediately." Emily's stomach churned. She clutched Max's leash tightly, her mind racing. She had to get out of there before they spotted her. That evening, Victor's threat became personal. As Emily and Max returned home, they found the garage door open and the interior ransacked. Max's makeshift bed was overturned, and his bowl lay smashed on the floor. Emily's chest tightened as she realized someone had been there, and it wasn't random. Her mother was furious. "This has gone too far." "Emily," Sarah exclaimed as she cleaned up the mess. "You're putting yourself and Max in danger." "I can't just stop, Mom," Emily argued, her voice breaking. "If we don't fight back, he'll destroy everything." "Fight back," Sarah scoffed, her frustration boiling over. "You're a 12-year-old girl. Emily, this isn't your fight. Let the authorities handle it." "They won't do anything," Emily snapped, tears streaming down her face. "They don't care." "Mom, no one does," Sarah sighed, her anger giving way to exhaustion. She knelt beside Emily, placing a hand on her shoulder. "I care, Emily. That's why I'm scared. I don't want to lose you, or Max." Emily nodded, wiping her eyes. "I know, Mom, but I can't just stand by. Max and we have to do this." Sarah didn't respond, but the worry in her eyes said everything. Victor's retaliation didn't end there. Over the next few days, Emily felt like she was being watched wherever she went. The whispers in town grew louder, people accusing her of causing trouble, some even siding with Victor. One afternoon, Emily and Max were walking home from the store when a truck roared past them, spraying dirt and gravel. Emily flinched, pulling Max closer. She caught a glimpse of Victor in the driver's seat, smirking as he sped away. That night, Emily gathered her small group of allies, Ms. Carter, Mr. Eldridge, and a few others at the diner. She showed them the new photos she had taken of Victor's operations and shared her fears about his growing aggression. "He's not just setting traps anymore," Emily said, her voice shaking. "He's targeting me and Max. We have to stop him before he goes any further." Ms. Carter nodded grimly. "We need to take this to the next level. Protests, petitions, anything to draw attention to what's happening here. And we need to be careful," Mr. Eldridge added. "Victor's not the kind of man to back down easily." The following day, Emily and Max returned to the forest, determined to gather more evidence. As they navigated the familiar trails, Max suddenly stopped, his body stiffening. Before Emily could react, A net sprang up from the ground, ensnaring Max in its tangle. "Max!" Emily screamed, rushing to free him, but her efforts were interrupted by a chilling voice. Well, look who's back." Victor sneered as he stepped out from the shadows. 2 of his men flanked him, each holding a rifle. "Let him go!" Emily shouted, her voice filled with desperation. Victor chuckled, shaking his head. "You've been a thorn in my side for too long. Little girl, maybe it's time you learned a lesson." Emily's heart pounded as Victor reached for the net, his intentions clear. But before he could act, Max snarled and lunged, breaking free with a burst of strength Emily didn't know he had. He placed himself between Emily and Victor, his teeth bared and his growl low and menacing. Victor took a step back, clearly startled by Max's ferocity. "You're lucky this time," he spat, retreating with his men. But this isn't over. Emily and Max returned home shaken but unbroken. That night, as Max rested at her feet, Emily stared out the window, her mind racing. Victor had made it clear he wasn't going to stop, but neither was she. "We're going to finish this, Max," Emily whispered, stroking his fur. Together, the fight had become personal, and Emily knew the stakes were higher than ever. But with Max by her side, she felt ready to face whatever came next. The forest had never felt more alive, yet more threatening. Each rustle of leaves or distant crack of a branch set Emily on edge. She knew Victor Kane was watching, waiting for the perfect moment to strike again. But if she was going to stop him, she couldn't do it alone. Emily realized she needed help, people who cared about the forest as much as she did. That night, she sat at her desk with Max lying beside her, his steady breathing a reminder of their shared mission. She pulled out a notebook and began jotting down names of those she thought might join her cause. At the top of her list was Ms. Carter, her science teacher. Ms. Carter had always spoken passionately about the environment, often encouraging her students to think critically about conservation. Then there was Mr. Eldridge, the elderly storyteller who seemed to know every secret about the forest. Emily added a few more names, students who had shown interest in her flyers and a local hiker who had once told her how much he loved Ravenwood's trails. "We're building a team," Max, she said softly, stroking his fur. "It's not just us anymore." The next morning, Emily visited Ms. Carter during her lunch break. She knocked hesitantly on the classroom door, her palms sweaty with nerves. "Come in," Ms. Carter called, looking up from a stack of papers. Her face lit up when she saw Emily. "Emily, what brings you here?" Emily hesitated, then launched into her story. She told Ms. Carter everything about the traps, Victor's threats, and the destruction she had witnessed in the forest. She even showed her the photos she had taken. Ms. Carter's expression shifted from curiosity to concern as she listened. When Emily finished, the teacher leaned back in her chair, her fingers steepled thoughtfully. "This is serious," Ms. Carter said finally. "But I believe you, and I want to help." Emily felt a surge of relief. "You do?" Ms. Carter nodded. "Absolutely. Ravenwood is a treasure, and it needs to be protected. Let's call a meeting. We'll gather anyone who's willing to help and come up with a plan." Over the next few days, Emily and Ms. Carter worked tirelessly to spread the word. They organized a meeting at the local library, printing new flyers and reaching out to anyone they thought might care. Emily even managed to convince her mother to let her use the diner's bulletin board to post an announcement. The night of the meeting, Emily was nervous. She sat at a table in the library's small conference room, fidgeting with the edge of her notebook as she waited for people to arrive. Max sat at her feet, his presence steadying her frayed nerves. Slowly, people began to trickle in. Ms. Carter was the first, carrying a folder filled with notes and research. Mr. Eldridge followed, his cane tapping against the floor as he took a seat. A couple of hikers arrived next, along with a few students Emily recognized from school. By the time the meeting started, a dozen people were gathered around the table. It wasn't a huge crowd, but it was enough to give Emily hope. "Thank you all for coming," Miss Carter began, her voice calm but commanding. "We're here because Ravenwood Forest is in danger. Victor Kane and his crew are destroying it piece by piece, and it's up to us to stop them." Emily shared her photos and told the group about her encounters with Victor. The room buzzed with murmurs of anger and disbelief as the full scope of the destruction became clear. "What can we do?" one of the hikers asked, his voice tinged with frustration. "Victor's got money and connections. How do we fight that?" "We fight it with the truth," Ms. Carter replied. "We expose what he's doing. Petitions, protests, even contacting the media. We need to make this public. And we start by protecting what's left of the forest." Emily added, "Max and I have been mapping out where the traps and clearings are. If we can dismantle the traps and document the damage, we'll have even more evidence." The group spent the rest of the evening brainstorming strategies. They divided tasks. Some would focus on gathering signatures for a petition. Others would reach out to local news outlets. And a few volunteers offered to patrol the forest with Emily to dismantle traps. As the meeting wrapped up, Emily felt a renewed sense of purpose. For the first time, she wasn't alone in her fight. The following morning, Emily and a small group of volunteers ventured into the forest. Max led the way, his nose low to the ground as he sniffed out traps. They worked methodically, documenting each trap they found before dismantling it. "This one's fresh," one of the hikers muttered, holding up a steel jaw trap. "They must have set it this morning." Emily's jaw tightened. "Then they're nearby. We need to be careful." As the group moved deeper into the woods, Max suddenly froze, his ears swiveling toward a sound Emily couldn't hear. He growled softly, his body tense. "What is it, boy?" Emily whispered, her heart pounding. Before anyone could react, a man's voice rang out. "What do you think you're doing?" Victor Kane stepped into the clearing, flanked by two of his men. His gaze swept over the group, his expression a mix of amusement and annoyance. "You're trespassing," Victor said coldly. "This is private property. It's public land." Ms. Carter shot back, her voice steady. "You have no right to set traps here." Victor's smirk widened. "And who's going to stop me? A bunch of tree huggers." Emily stepped forward, her hands clenched into fists. "We're not afraid of you." Victor chuckled darkly. "You should be." The encounter ended without violence, but the tension lingered long after Victor and his men disappeared into the trees. Emily's group continued their patrols, but they were more cautious now, always watching their backs. That evening, Emily sat on her porch with Max staring out at the darkening forest. She knew the fight was far from over, but she also knew she wasn't alone anymore. "We've got allies now," Max, she said softly, scratching behind his ears. "We're stronger together." Max thumped his tail against the porch, his silent agreement giving Emily the courage she needed to keep going. The air in Ravenwood felt heavier, charged with a tension that Emily couldn't shake. The small group of allies she had gathered continued their efforts to dismantle traps and document the destruction. But Victor Kane and his men had doubled down. Every trap they removed was replaced within a day, and Victor's warnings grew bolder. One evening, as the sun dipped low, casting long shadows through the trees, Emily and Max were patrolling the forest with two of the hikers from their group, Josh and Maggie. Max suddenly stopped in his tracks, his ears swiveling and his nose twitching. Emily crouched beside him, her heart racing. "What is it, boy?" she whispered, but Max's growl was all the answer she needed. A rustling sound came from the bushes ahead, and Emily's stomach twisted. She motioned for the others to stay back as she crept forward, Max at her side, peering through the undergrowth. She froze. Ahead of them, Victor and his men were gathered in a clearing. But this wasn't just another routine trap setup. Wooden crates stacked high filled the area, marked with the words "Live Game" in bold letters. Beside them, several cages held terrified animals, their eyes wide with fear. A generator hummed nearby, powering a large spotlight that illuminated the scene. "They're planning something big," Emily whispered, her voice shaking. "We have to stop them." Josh's voice was barely above a whisper. "What do we do? There are too many of them." Emily clenched her fists. "We'll call the others. If we can get everyone here." "Maybe we can." She was cut off by the sharp crack of a branch behind her. The noise echoed through the clearing, and Victor's head snapped in their direction. "Who's there?" he barked, his hand moving to the knife on his belt. "Run!" Emily hissed, grabbing Max's leash and taking off through the woods. Josh and Maggie followed close behind, their footsteps pounding against the forest floor. Behind them, Victor's voice rang out. "Get them! Don't let them get away!" The forest became a maze of shadows and shifting shapes as Emily and her friends darted between the trees. Max stayed at her side, his sharp barks warning of dangers she couldn't see. Emily's lungs burned, but she forced herself to keep going, adrenaline propelling her forward. They finally came to a halt in a dense thicket. Gasping for breath, Emily clutched Max's collar, trying to calm both herself and the dog. "We need to go back," Maggie panted. "Those animals, they're gonna take them tonight. We can't just let that happen." "She's right," Emily said, her voice firm despite her fear. "We have to do something." Josh hesitated, glancing over his shoulder. "It's too dangerous. We're outnumbered." Emily squared her shoulders. "Then I'll go alone." Max growled, as if to say he wouldn't let her face this alone. "No," Maggie said, stepping forward. "We'll all go, but we need a plan." The group regrouped with the others at the edge of the forest, sharing what they had seen. Miss Carter's face turned pale as she listened. "They're trafficking animals," she said grimly. "If they get those crates out of here, we may never be able to stop them." "We won't let that happen," Emily said, her determination burning bright. Together, the group devised a plan, while Miss Carter and a few others would call the authorities. Emily and a small team would return to the clearing to stall Victor and his men. When Emily and Max arrived back at the clearing, the scene had grown even more chaotic. Victor's men were loading the crates onto a truck, their voices echoing in the still night. Emily's stomach churned as she saw the fear in the animals' eyes. Max let out a low growl, his body tense. Emily placed a hand on his back, whispering, "Not yet, boy." She waited until the men were distracted before stepping out of the shadows. "Hey!" she shouted, her voice cutting through the noise. Victor turned, his expression twisting into a sneer. "You again. Didn't I warn you to stay out of this?" "I'm not afraid of you," Emily shot back, her heart pounding. "This forest doesn't belong to you. It belongs to everyone." Victor's smirk faded, replaced by a cold glare. "Brave words for a little girl, but bravery won't save you." With a snap of his fingers, two of his men began advancing toward her. Max barked sharply, stepping in front of Emily, his teeth bared. "Call off your mutt," Victor growled. "Make me," Emily retorted, her voice steady despite the fear clawing at her chest. The standoff escalated quickly. As Victor's men moved closer, Max lunged, snarling with a ferocity Emily had never seen before. He drove the men back, giving Emily just enough time to sprint toward the cages. "Help me!" she shouted to Maggie and Josh, who had just arrived. Together, they began opening the cages, freeing the terrified animals. Chaos erupted as the animals bolted into the woods, their cries mixing with the shouts of Victor's men. Emily worked quickly, her hands shaking as she fumbled with the locks. Suddenly, Victor grabbed her arm, yanking her away from the last cage. "You've caused enough trouble," he snarled, his grip tightening. Max roared in anger, charging at Victor and knocking him to the ground. Emily stumbled back, her heart racing as the two struggled. Victor reached for his knife, but Max was faster, snapping at his hand and forcing him to drop it. The sound of sirens pierced the air, growing louder with each passing second. Victor's men froze, their eyes darting toward the forest edge where flashing lights appeared. "This isn't over," Victor spat, shoving Max away and scrambling to his feet. He and his men fled into the trees, disappearing into the night. As the authorities arrived, Emily sank to her knees, tears streaming down her face as she hugged Max. "You did it, boy," she whispered. "We did it." The officers quickly secured the remaining crates and took statements from Emily and the others. It wasn't a complete victory. Victor had escaped, but the animals were safe, and his operation had been exposed. Emily looked down at Max, who was panting heavily but wagging his tail. "You're a hero," she said softly, stroking his fur. Max licked her hand, his eyes shining with a quiet, unshakable loyalty. The raid on Victor Kane's operation had been a small victory, but Emily knew it was far from over. Victor had escaped, and his threats hung over Ravenwood like a dark cloud. The forest was quieter now, but not in the way it should have been. There was an eerie stillness, as though the trees themselves were holding their breath. Emily and Max continued their patrols, dismantling traps and documenting evidence. The group of allies she had built remained vigilant, but the danger was growing. Victor's men were laying more traps, each one more sophisticated and cruel than the last. One cold afternoon, Emily and Max ventured deeper into the forest than they ever had before. The air was crisp, and the sky was overcast, casting the woods in a muted gray light. Max was alert, his ears twitching at every sound, his nose low to the ground. Emily felt a chill run down her spine. She couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. They came to a clearing where the remnants of Victor's operation lay in ruin. Broken crates and discarded equipment were scattered across the ground, a testament to their previous victory. But something was wrong. Max froze, his body tense, and let out a low, rumbling growl. "What is it, Max?" Emily whispered, scanning the clearing. Before she could react, a sharp snap echoed through the air. A net shot up from the ground, ensnaring Max in its tangled ropes. He barked and struggled, his teeth gnashing at the net, but he couldn't break free. "Max!" Emily screamed, rushing forward. A voice rang out, cold and familiar. Well, look who walked right into my trap." Victor Kane stepped out from the shadows, his face twisted with triumph. Two of his men flanked him, each holding rifles. Emily's heart pounded as she placed herself between Victor and Max. "Let him go," she demanded, her voice trembling with both fear and anger. Victor chuckled, shaking his head. "You've been a thorn in my side for too long, little girl. I warned you to stay out of my way." Emily's fists clenched. "This forest doesn't belong to you. It belongs to everyone." Victor's smirk faded, replaced by a dangerous glare. "Not anymore. This forest is mine, and I'll do whatever it takes to protect my investment." He motioned to one of his men, who raised his rifle and aimed it at Max. "No!" Emily shouted, but before she could do anything, Max roared with fury. He lunged against the net, snapping at the ropes with renewed strength. The net gave way just as the man pulled the trigger. The shot missed, grazing a tree behind them, but it was enough to send Max into a frenzy. He charged at the man, knocking him to the ground. Victor barked an order, and his other man leveled his rifle at Max. Emily's world seemed to slow as she saw the second shot fired. Max yelped, stumbling but refusing to back down. Blood stained his golden fur, but he growled low in his throat. His eyes locked on Victor. Victor stepped forward, pulling a knife from his belt. "That mutt doesn't know when to quit, does he?" Emily's heart raced as she scrambled to Max's side. "Stop this," she cried, her voice breaking. "Haven't you done enough?" But Victor was relentless. He lunged toward them, his knife raised. Max, despite his injuries, surged forward one final time. His powerful frame collided with Victor, sending them both tumbling into the dense underbrush. Emily heard a loud crack as Victor lost his footing and fell into a shallow ravine. His shouts of anger faded as he disappeared into the shadows. Max stood at the edge of the ravine, his body swaying. Blood dripped from his wounds, staining the ground beneath him. Emily ran to his side, her hands trembling as she reached for him. "You're okay, Max," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "You're going to be okay." Max looked up at her, his eyes filled with the same unwavering loyalty that had carried them through every danger. His tail wagged weakly, as if to reassure her that everything was all right. But Emily knew the truth. His breathing was shallow, his body trembling with effort. "Stay with me, Max," she pleaded, her voice breaking. "Please, don't leave me." Max let out a soft whine, nuzzling her hand one last time. His body went still, and Emily's sobs filled the quiet forest. In the weeks that followed, the authorities launched a full investigation into Victor Kane's activities. With the evidence Emily and her allies had gathered, they were able to shut down his operations for good. Victor himself was found injured in the ravine and taken into custody. The forest began to heal, and Emily's small group grew into a larger movement dedicated to preserving Ravenwood. They established a sanctuary in Max's honor, a place where the forest's animals could live free from harm. At the sanctuary's entrance stood a plaque, engraved with the words, "In memory of Max, a true guardian of the wild." Emily often visited the sanctuary, walking the trails she and Max had explored together. The forest was quieter now, but it felt alive with his presence. One autumn morning, as she stood in a familiar clearing, Emily closed her eyes and let the breeze wash over her. She could almost feel Max by her side, his golden fur brushing against her leg. "You did it, Max," she whispered, a small smile breaking through her tears. "We did it." The forest hummed around her, vibrant and alive, a testament to the bond they had shared and the sacrifices they had made. And though Max was gone, he would always be with her, in the rustle of the leaves, the warmth of the sun, and the unyielding strength of her memories. Years passed, but the memory of Max never faded. For Emily, he wasn't just a dog, he was a guardian, a friend, and a symbol of hope. Ravenwood Forest, once under the shadow of destruction, had transformed into a sanctuary, thriving with life. It stood as a testament to the sacrifices made to protect it. And at the heart of it all was Max's legacy. Emily, now in her early 20s, had taken on the role of a conservationist, dedicating her life to preserving Ravenwood and educating others about the importance of protecting nature. She often led guided tours through the sanctuary, sharing stories about the forest's history and the extraordinary dog who had fought to save it. One brisk autumn morning, Emily stood at the entrance of the sanctuary, adjusting a sign that read, "Welcome to Ravenwood Sanctuary, a place of life and legacy." The sun cast a warm glow over the forest, and the air was filled with the sound of birdsong. A group of schoolchildren arrived for a tour, their excited chatter reminding Emily of her younger self. "Is it true that a dog saved this forest?" a boy asked, his wide eyes filled with curiosity. Emily smiled, her chest tightening with emotion. "It's true. His name was Max, and he was the bravest dog I've ever known. He gave everything to protect this place." As she led the group along the trails, Emily pointed out the clearing where Max had made his final stand. The area had been restored, now brimming with wildflowers and young trees. At its center stood a stone monument, etched with Max's likeness and the words, "In memory of Max, a true guardian of the wild." The children gathered around the monument, their faces solemn as Emily recounted Max's story. She told them about the traps, Victor Kane, and the night Max had fought to protect the forest. By the end, some of the children were wiping away tears, while others looked determined. "What happened to the bad guy?" one girl asked, her voice small. "He was caught," Emily replied, "and he'll never hurt this forest again." But it wasn't just about stopping him, it was about standing up for what's right, even when it's hard. Later that afternoon, as the group departed, Emily found herself drawn to a familiar clearing. She hadn't been there in months, too busy with her work to revisit the place that held so many memories. The forest was quiet, save for the gentle rustling of leaves in the breeze. Emily knelt beside the monument, running her fingers over Max's engraved face. "I hope I've made you proud, boy," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Everything I've done, it's all because of you." As she stood, a sudden movement caught her eye. A small, golden shape darted through the trees, its tail wagging furiously. Emily's heart skipped a beat. For a moment, she thought she was imagining things. But then the shape emerged, a young dog, its golden fur gleaming in the sunlight. The dog approached cautiously, its curious eyes locking onto hers. Emily knelt, holding out her hand. "Hey there," she said softly. "Where did you come from?" The dog sniffed her hand, then nuzzled it gently. Emily felt a lump rise in her throat as she stroked its fur. The resemblance to Max was uncanny, and she couldn't help but feel as though he had sent this pup to her. "You remind me of someone," Emily said, her voice trembling. "Someone very special." The dog barked once, a sound that seemed to echo with familiarity and warmth. Emily smiled through her tears, feeling a sense of peace she hadn't felt in years. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the forest in a golden glow, Emily and the young dog walked back toward the sanctuary together. The path ahead was uncertain, but Emily felt ready to face it, knowing that Max's spirit lived on, not just in her heart, but in the forest he had fought so hard to protect.